on Monday, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he was in China. He met with China's President Xi Jinping to ostensibly repair relations between the two countries. Now, 48 hours later, US President Joe Biden seems to have put his foot in it, labelling Xi a dictator. Here's a report on that from Reuters.
Barely a day after highly sensitive talks between the US and China, Joe Biden called China's leader a dictator. The US president made the remark about Xi Jinping off camera at a fundraiser. He also suggested, not for the first time, that Xi and other Chinese leaders were embarrassed when a Chinese spy balloon was blown off course over US airspace earlier this year. Speaking at a fundraiser in California, Biden said, quote, "The reason why Xi Jinping got very upset in terms of when I shot that balloon down with 2 boxcars full of spy equipment in it was he didn't know it was there."
Pleased to say former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer now joins me from London. I guess President Biden, Alexander, great to catch up with you again, is telling the truth, but it's probably not very good timing.
Well, probably, but I think it's one of those incidents that will blow over fairly quickly. He could have chosen his words more carefully, but you can imagine in the excitement of a fundraiser him saying something like that. These kind of incidents when the relationship is tense are always going to occur when one of the leaders says something which might be a bit unfortunate. And it does remind you that in diplomacy, words are bullets, to use an expression. But this will blow over quite quickly. And the important thing is that the US administration, as well as the Chinese administration, do what they can to try to stabilize the relationship. That's in all of our interests. And I think the visit to Beijing by Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, was a good move.
How important was it that he actually went there and got the high-level meetings that he actually got? I mean, does that give you some hope that the relationship between China and the rest of the world might be on the improve?
Yes, and I think this is an important Australian-oriented point to make. China has learnt the hard way that the West isn't as feckless and weak as they had imagined and they had estimated. And the relevance of Australia is that, in particular, 2 or 3 years ago, they decided to take on Australia and very deliberately chose Australia as the country they'd take on, an Indo-Pacific country, but a Western country allied to the United States. And they thought Australia would fold. And they were completely wrong. What they learned was not only the resilience of the then Australian government, it was the Morrison government, but they learned how many friends Australia had around the world. And as a result of that harsh lesson, which led to China becoming increasingly isolated diplomatically, they have changed their foreign policy and softened their foreign policy. So it is going to make it easier now for the United States administration to engage constructively with Beijing and perhaps get some greater, well, I think the right word here is transparency into the relationship.
As an Australian living overseas in London, as you are, from that distance, what do you make of this debate around the voice referendum? It seems the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese's nailed his colours to the wall. He really is saying to everybody, you've got to vote yes, and he's put a lot of political capital into this. Do you think this will get up? And what are your observations from that distance about this debate?
There are a couple of observations. The first is that in all of my life, I've always been opposed to race-based constitutions and politics. You know, I can remember when I was a student how we protested against the apartheid regime in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela was our hero. So this idea of inserting into a liberal democratic constitution like Australia's a race-based institution from which, for example, you and I are excluded from ever participating in on the basis of our race. I mean, that is complete anathema to me. And I can see Australians don't think that way. But that is complete anathema to me. I would never vote for a race-based institution. And the second thing is that really strikes me about it, in a country with such deep roots in democracy and democratic institutions, the government, the Australian government, won't tell us how members of the Voice will be chosen. But apparently they won't be chosen by election, but somehow they'll be chosen. Somehow all these people will suddenly appear. I have never heard of the public voting for something where they knew so little about it. I mean, how are these people going to be appointed? Who is going to be appointed? And there's a refusal to answer that question. Why will they not answer that question? Why will they not give us the details? And the answer to that is that apparently if they give us the details, we're more likely to vote against it. Well, what does that tell you? What does that tell you about this idea? So honestly, I mean, I would be surprised if it got up, because there are so many. It's such an untransparent, devious, race-based initiative. And I think, you know, this comes from political radicals and extremists. Moderate, mainstream people don't support this sort of thing.
Yeah, I share your concerns. How's it been being an Australian in London after the Bazball test and that extraordinary effort by the Australians in the first Ashes match?
Well, particularly by the captain himself, it was an extraordinary performance. So I was at a dinner for an organisation, doesn't matter what it is, it's called the International Democratic Union, with John and Jeanette Howard. We were both there, and Tony Abbott was there as well. And I had my mobile phone on which I could get the cricket. And we were watching the closing overs of the game, sitting in this dining room in the middle of London, surrounded by Poms, of course, who were showing no interest in the game. But it was hugely exciting. It was incredible. And I think a great thing for Test cricket. It's going to make Test cricket much more popular and set the Ashes series alive over here.